The multiverse has become a popular topic in Western culture, and the idea has been championed by scientists, science fiction writers, and Hollywood. But does the Bible lend any support to the idea of an infinite number of universes? Dr. David K. Bernard tackles this question next. Welcome to Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, a podcast dedicated to helping modern-day believers live out the teachings of the first century church. This podcast is part of the teaching ministry of Dr. David K. Bernard. Dr. Bernard has dedicated his life to studying the Bible and helping believers apply its message to their daily lives. In Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, Dr. Bernard answers your questions about what the Bible teaches and how those teachings apply to everyday life. So we're releasing this episode on Labor Day. If our audience members remember, last year on Labor Day, we asked you about biblical evidence for aliens. So we're developing a pattern here of asking you sort of offbeat questions on Labor Day, because this year we want to ask your thoughts on the idea of a multiverse. So the concept of a multiverse, or the existence of multiple universes, has gotten quite a bit of publicity in recent years, particularly through popular culture. And it's been used to explain everything from the existence of life to the potential for time travel. And I have to admit, a lot of my understanding of this concept comes from actually reading Michael Crichton, his book Timeline, which uses this idea of a multiverse to explain time travel. But it's not just a science fiction thing. I do want to point out that popular physicists like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Stephen Hawking, they have lent some credence to this idea. Does the Bible say anything that might support this idea of a multiverse? And maybe you can explain it better than I have for our listeners. Or is this concept, would you say it's incompatible with the scriptures?
I would say the scripture doesn't define it either way, but I think this is a very important discussion for apologetic reasons. And I do discuss it a little bit in my book Anchor Points. So let me explain. First of all, this concept is the idea that there are multiple universes. So if you think about it carefully, by definition, anything we could discover is in our universe. So anything we could discover by a telescope, by whatever scientific means of observation, by definition, that would be part of our universe. So literally then, we can't know if there is another universe. Because if we could, it would be our universe. So the idea of multiple universes is somewhat theoretical. And so why would there even be this other than the idea of science fiction? Now, let me just hasten to add, could God have created 1 million universes? Yes. We don't know about them. So the Bible doesn't tell us about them. And by the way, the Bible is not a scientific textbook. Moreover, the Bible is not a compendium of universal knowledge. It does not tell us everything we want to know. It tells us what we need to know. So what it tells us is that God created us, we fell into sin, need to be saved, and God provided a plan of salvation. And all of us need to follow God's plan. So that's what the Bible tells us. So it's irrelevant if there are aliens or if there are other universes. So the Bible is not going to be talking about stuff like that. So does the Bible give us any indication that there is a multiverse? No. Does the Bible tell us there is, in fact, not a multiverse? No. Could God do it? Yes. Maybe in eternity we'll find out. And if there are trillions of other universes, maybe that's part of what's going to keep us busy for eternity, But the reason why this actually has become a serious discussion is people are trying to avoid the existence of God. So here's what it boils down to, which I describe in Anchor Points. Scientists of all kinds, including atheists, have discovered that the universe is fine-tuned for human life. What that means is there are a number of laws of physics and there are a number of constants, universal constants, like the speed of light, for example, that are just set. They're given. You can't derive them from any scientific equations. They're fundamental. They're just there. And so you would think if the universe just came into existence accidentally, that these numbers and these laws would be completely random. But instead, it looks like somebody carefully picked them to make sure that human life would be possible. So I'll give you an example from astronomer Martin Rees. He wrote a book, Just Six Numbers. And he says, and this is going to get a little technical, so I'll try to explain it as simple as I can. Number one, because I want the audience to understand. Number two, because my understanding is limited as well. I'm not a physicist, okay? But if you know just a little bit basic about physics, that an atom, the nucleus of atom has protons and neutrons that are bound together. Well, protons have positive charge. So for two protons to be together, they would repel each other. So there has to be some force, and there's something called the strong nuclear force that's more powerful than the electrical force. So the electrical force will repel them, but the strong nuclear force would combine them. Also, there in the nucleus of the atom, there are neutrons, which don't have a charge, but they are helpful in having more protons bind together. And why is that important? Because the number of protons determines the element. So if an atom has one proton, it's hydrogen. If it has two protons, it's helium. And on, you build all the elements that the whole universe is made of is based on adding more protons. So you have to have this force to pull them together. So Martin Rees uses a number. He says, I don't know what the measurement means, but he says this force that binds the protons and neutrons together in an atom is 0.007. He says if it was just a little weaker, 0.006, just a hair weaker, it would be too weak and two protons would never stick together. So the whole universe would be atoms of only one proton, which means the whole universe would just be hydrogen. So you couldn't have human life. On the other hand, if that force were just a little bit stronger, 0.008, so now we're talking about thousandths, okay? If it's a little stronger, it would be too strong. And so one proton could never stand alone. It would always immediately be bound with the second proton. So you couldn't have hydrogen. Well, hydrogen, of course, is what we get water from, H2O. Hydrogen is what the stars and the sun are made of, the fuel of the sun. So if you didn't have water and if you didn't have a sun, you wouldn't have human life. So that one number has to be right in this narrow margin of hundredths or thousandths. If it's a little off, we couldn't exist. Well, that's just one number. There are many, many such numbers. So you mentioned Stephen Hawking. His teacher and later his colleague that worked with him, Roger Penrose, is basically an atheist or agnostic, but he said somehow evolution can't explain why all these numbers fall into place. So I read his book. He's written a couple books. They're older now, but The Emperor's Mind and The Emperor's New Mind, I think there's the names of them, but he goes through this detailed scientific calculation to say, now if there were, and he uses the phrase creator for lack of a better term, which he says, if the universe just happened, if someone just chose the universe to have all these components that would be compatible with human life, the odds would be 10 to the 123rd power, which that means 1 followed by 123 zeros. It's a number too big for us to name. He said to give you an idea of how big that is, it's more than all the particles in the universe. Okay? So he says that's the odds. If a creator said all possible universes and the creator just throwing a dart, the odds are 10 to the 123rd power that his dart would hit that particular universe that would support human life. So that's his way of describing it. Of course, he's not even sure there is a creator, but he's saying, here's the problem. We can't explain why this universe existed. It's fantastically, inconceivably, incredibly, improbable that it could just accidentally happen. Well, Martin Rees himself calculates, well, he doesn't. I have another physicist, Richard Morris, calculates that the odds are 10 to the 50th power. Alvin Plantinga, who is a Christian philosopher, the odds are 10 to the 100th power. So all these are numbers too big for us to comprehend. But they're basically saying for all of these different constants and laws to all fall into place to make human life possible, it's incredibly improbable. So the most logical explanation, if you had these odds, if somebody went to a physicist and said, well, let's just use the odds of a 3-to-1. I saw something happen and the odds are 1 in a trillion. Well, the physicists say, well, that means it didn't happen. That means you had an error in your observation, because things that are 1 in a trillion just don't happen. The odds are so inconceivably small. The more likely explanation is there's human error or human intervention or somebody planned this. So then the logical thing, if our universe is so incredibly improbable, I mean, somebody planned it, i.e. God. Yeah. Well, so the philosophers are trying to get around that. They can't deny the facts. Well, let's just use 1 in a trillion, although the numbers I've given you make a trillion look like nothing. But so here's the logic of the multiverse. So here's where we're getting to your question. So a philosopher says, well, there can't be a God. It has to be accident, has to be a random. How can I explain the odds? Well, if there are a trillion universes, then the 1 in a trillion odds, it means, one of those universes will support human life. Of course, there's 2 problems with that. One, it's not 1 in a trillion. It's 1, depending on who you listen, but 10 to the 50th power, 1 followed by 50 zeros or 100 zeros or 123 zeros. So are there that many universes? If there are that many universes, okay, the odds are there's going to be 1 that can support human life. So no, you don't need a creator. You just need, a gazillion universes. But then that's the second problem is, okay, you're having a hard time explaining how 1 universe came in randomly. How do you explain how a gazillion universes came to be randomly? That's even more mind-boggling than our universe. So to me, the idea of the multiverse started by saying, well, we have to rule God out of existence. So the only way to explain our improbability is say there are multiple universes. But first of all, that doesn't really do justice to the odds. Are you really saying there are an uncountable number of universes? And second, that doesn't solve your ultimate problem of origins. Now you have to ask, how did those inconceivable number of universes pop into existence? So that's why I think the multiverse is so far-fetched that it's not really created for scientific purposes. It's mainly created for apologetic purposes to deny the existence of God. And here's another thing. It's really weird about this. If you have what is almost an infinite number of universes, that means, and you have infinite time, that means anything literally can happen. So the people that sincerely believe in this, they will say, well, if we all evolved, well, given an almost infinite number of universes, the chances are in one of those universes, you, Jonathan Moore, evolved. But you evolved to have blonde hair and blue eyes, and you evolved to speak French. And Shakespeare evolved, and he wrote all of his writings except one sentence was different. So, if you have nearly an infinite number of universes, you'll have an infinite number of William Shakespeare's, and they'll all be, one sentence off, So if you think about that with these mind-numbing statistics, literally anything can happen given a near infinite number of times, an infinite number of years. And so then that leads to crazy things. What does it mean to be a human? What it means to have personality? What does it mean to have free will? If in another universe I decide to be a Mormon, what does that make me? Who is that other person in that other universe? Is that me or is that somebody else? And of course, once you start playing those games, when you start throwing infinity in there, you just make a mockery of human existence and free will and of course, ultimately God. So while I wouldn't rule out that God has created other universes, hopefully we'll find out in eternity. The people that are promoting it primarily because they just can't stand the idea that God could have actually created one universe compatible with human life. And so I think we need to call them out on that to say, if your theory is true, it still requires God to make it happen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. We also appreciate it when you share Apostolic Life in the 21st Century with a friend or family member. And make plans to join us again next time as we look at how the Bible applies to everyday life.